repeat after me. I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear.
I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear.
2025 was a year when the global order felt increasingly fragile. War expanded, diplomacy struggled, and the rules that once guided international relations were openly tested.
This is a tremendous day.
Hello and welcome to this Arise News end-of-year special, A World in Transition. I'm Adefemi Akisanya, and together we will reflect on the biggest global stories that defined this year, from war in Africa and the Middle East to diplomatic tensions, controversial rhetoric on the world stage, and growing questions about the future of democracy. We begin where diplomacy struggled most, in preventing conflict. In Sudan, a power struggle between rival generals descended into a devastating civil war. Tens of thousands were killed, millions were forced from their homes. Sudan became a stark reminder of what happens when diplomacy fails early. Mediation came late and with limited leverage. The humanitarian crisis deepened, spilling across borders and threatening regional stability. Across West Africa, military takeovers once again replaced elected governments. From Mali, Burkina Faso to Niger, coups became more frequent and more entrenched. In late November, Guinea-Bissau saw military officers seize power, deposing President Umaru Sissoco Embaló just 3 days after a contentious presidential election, and the day before the results were due to be announced. The coup saw land and air borders close, trapping dozens of foreign election observers, including former Nigerian President Goodluck Jonathan, who upon his return to Nigeria said he found the coup to be suspicious.
What happened in Guinea-Bissau, I wouldn't call it a coup. It was not a coup. For want of better word, I would say maybe it was a ceremonial coup. Because for two things, it is the President Embaló, that announced the coup. Before later, a military man came up to address the world that they were in charge of everywhere. Then Embaló has already announced the coup, which is strange.
Embaló remains exiled in the Republic of Congo, Congo-Brazzaville, but with one of his loyalists and former Chief of Army Staff, Major General Horta Intaa, sworn in as interim president for a year, he leaves behind a legacy of democratic instability. Democracy in West Africa was again under threat when a group of rogue soldiers attempted to overthrow President Patrice Talon, who had previously moved to alter the country's constitution. Following requests for help from the Beninois government, Nigeria deployed fighter jets and ground troops, conducting airstrikes on the national TV station and a military base near the airport to dislodge the mutineers. 2025 also saw an extraordinary diplomatic incident. 11 Nigerian military personnel and their aircraft were detained by Burkina Faso for 9 days. It took a high-level delegation from the federal government, led by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Yusuf Tugar, to secure their release. The entire incident highlighted just how strained relations have become between neighbors once bound by shared security arrangements. If diplomacy was under strain on the ground, it was also tested at the podium. At the United Nations General Assembly, world leaders gathered, but unity proved elusive. The General Assembly is designed to be the ultimate forum for diplomacy. My interview with Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed touched on those topics.
It is surreal times, and we are faced with enormous crises, geopolitical tensions, and whatever we say, people are feeling the pain and people are losing. But there's still an enormous amount of hope, because as you look back, what founded this incredible institution was the Charter, very much about we the people, very much about peace. The Declaration of Human Rights that really told us that these 5 rights are indivisible, but they're progressive. They're in our constitutions today. And so looking back and coming forward, you are seeing the many times we thought that there was to be no resolve, whether it was from the Cold War, or it was from HIV and AIDS, or more recently COVID. And in all of that, we found solutions to them. And we are better for it.
Though with scathing comments from the likes of US President Donald Trump, the 2025 edition's Great Debate often felt more like a platform for political posturing. Speaking of the US president, he captured international attention and criticism with remarks suggesting he would send troops, guns a-blazing, into Nigeria over claims of Christian genocide. The threat may have cooled down, but in the aftermath of the US fact-finding mission to Benue, tightened visa restrictions, and another delegation arriving in Abuja, US-Nigerian relations remain uneasy.
If the Nigerian government continues to allow the killing of Christians, the USA will immediately stop all aid and assistance to Nigeria. We're going to do things to Nigeria that Nigeria is not going to be happy about and may very well go into that now disgraced country, guns a-blazing, to completely wipe out the Islamic terrorists who are committing these horrible, horrible atrocities.
Well, that US threat to invade Nigeria raised serious concerns about the respect for sovereignty and the tone of global diplomacy. For many here in Africa, they echoed long-standing frustrations about how the continent is addressed on the world stage. Russia's invasion of Ukraine continued into 2025 with renewed offensives, heightened NATO involvement, and global economic fallout. But no conflict this year commanded global attention quite like the Israel-Hamas war in the Middle East. As fighting intensified, civilians bore the brunt, and diplomacy narrowed its focus to one urgent priority: hostages. I was in Israel covering the hostage release, speaking with families suspended between hope and fear. When hostages were released, the relief was palpable, though tempered by the reality that many remained unaccounted for. Those moments captured the human side of diplomacy: fragile, emotional, and deeply personal. Beyond conflict, democracy itself faced serious questions, even in countries that did hold elections. In Tanzania, President Samia Suluhu Hassan secured more than 98% of the vote. But the landslide came amid reports of a heavy crackdown on opposition figures and restrictions on political activity. Elections can bring stability, but when political space is restricted, accountability becomes harder to sustain. In Cameroon, President Paul Biya won another term, extending a presidency that has already lasted more than 4 decades. If he completes this term, he would remain in office until the age of 99. When leadership remains unchanged for decades, the challenge is no longer just governance, it's succession. From overwhelming victories to indefinite rule, democracy this year was often procedural but deeply contested. Meanwhile, relations between the United States and China remain defined by competition, caution, calculation, and persistence. High-level talks helped stabilize ties, but deep disagreements over Taiwan, technology, military expansion, and global influence remained unresolved. 2025 also underscored a steady shift towards a more multipolar world. Groups like BRICS expanded their influence, seeking alternatives to Western-led financial systems. At the same time, climate change and artificial intelligence emerged as new geopolitical battlegrounds where cooperation was necessary, but competition inevitable. In April, the world's Catholic community entered a period of mourning. Pope Francis, a global spiritual figure and voice for the poor, died at the age of 88, prompting tributes from world leaders and faithful around the world. His death set in motion the centuries-old conclave tradition, and in May, cardinals gathered in the Sistine Chapel to choose his successor. White smoke signaled history. Cardinal Robert Francis Provost, a Chicago-born American, was elected Pope Leo XIV, the first pope from the United States.
La pace sia con tutti voi.
But you see, this year was not defined by crisis alone. Amid the turmoil, moments of resilience and unity stood out, reminding us of shared humanity. These moments may not shift geopolitics, but they do matter. They remind us why diplomacy, stability, and good governance are worth striving for. As the year comes to a close, the world faces difficult choices. Diplomacy must adapt, democracy must be defended, and the language used on the global stage must carry responsibility. Well, those were the geopolitical stories that shaped 2025 and will continue to shape the next. I'm Adefemi Akisoya. Thank you for watching this Arise News End of Year special. Wishing you a very happy 2026.
What a beautiful report by Arise International correspondent Adefemi Akinsonya, detailing some of the major events that we saw taking place with geopolitics and geopolitical relations. And I think the common denominator we can all agree on that caused one of the biggest shifts was, of course, the coming into office of Donald Trump for his second term as President of the United States. And shall I say, him making good on all of the promises that could also be seen as threats that he had made on the campaign trail, whether it be through tariffs, whether it be through a highly introspective foreign policy position for the United States with MAGA, Make America Great Again, America First. And of course, that trickled over to the rest of the world and ultimately led us into a multipolar world. And when we look at that multipolarity, there are several things to consider. I think back to when I had the opportunity to listen to Mike Pompeo, who was saying that he doesn't feel that the American hegemony is a threat, that it's coming to an end. He feels that this narrative is propaganda that's being perpetuated by the Chinese. However, we can see a significant shift in the global south, moving around to see how best to cooperate and collaborate in order to ensure that there is global stability. I remember Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala of WTO had said that this year showed us that global trade networks have more resilience than we anticipated, because we'd expected so many institutions to crumble, so many trade relations, a lot of exchange between nations to crumble, but it showed great resilience even in the face of these huge systemic changes and shifts, if I may call it that. Then I think more than ever this year we saw a significant rise, a grow in importance for BRICS. Now, of course, BRICS is not a new organization, and BRICS also added a number of member states and friends of BRICS as well that are not full members. But when you see developments such as that, China this year was able to ensure that their balance of payments was dominated by yuan payments. So they're no longer dependent on US dollars. Russia surviving through another year of sanctions and being able to do so without the use of US dollars, without the use of the SWIFT system, and also with the ability to somehow still be able to trade their oil with partners like India. And we've also seen India make moves. So this BRICS collaboration has been able to steer the global south through what could have been a very difficult period. South Africa as well, important to bring into the conversation, because South Africa, which was hugely dependent on American trade, on AGOA, saw huge impact to its employment rate when some industries were hit by the tariffs and, of course, by the frosty relationship between Pretoria and Washington, D.C. But a shift towards the Orient has seen agricultural trade being boosted as well, and has seen a relative amount of stability returning to South African markets. That's on that. Now, Adefemi also touched quite significantly on sort of the pathway and the performance of democracy on this continent this year. Now, this year was very different to last year, because if you remember last year, at the end of the year, we were talking about how many incumbent presidents had conceded and had handed over power, whether it be in Ghana, whether it be in Senegal. But this year, we're looking at, a number of elections that could be argued not to have been credible at all. You're looking at Cameroon. You're looking at Guinea-Bissau, which to this day has still been unable to announce the election results that exist. But because of a stage-managed crisis, the legitimacy of the government of that country is currently being held hostage by military intervention. So when you look at those developments, and then of course yesterday we'd spoken about the Alliance des États du Sahel and how they continue to collaborate. We looked at ECOWAS as well and how ECOWAS has fared throughout this year. I think we're able to kind of take away the fact that this has not been one of the most glowing years for democracy and for governance across the African continent. There's a lot of cooperation that needs to happen, a lot of collaboration, specifically bringing the conversation home to Nigeria. If you look at Nigeria's relations with ECOWAS and the state of ECOWAS and the fact that we saw the incident that happened in Benin Republic being Nigeria's only border with ECOWAS at the moment. Nigeria is surrounded by non-ECOWAS nations. Surely in 2026, what we do hope to see is enhanced collaboration and enhanced commitment to democracy from the West to the East and to the South of Africa as well.
I mean, very apt analysis there. So if I'm to segment the year, I would say number one, it's been a year of the global hegemons. The global hegemons, the Americans of this world, China of this world, raising its ugly head. Trump came in 20th of January. It pretty much upended the world in the space of 2-3 months. The world is still living through almost all of that. You can say campaign promise, but people's lives have never remained the same. There's been a distortion in America with daily protests with ICE. There's also been a distortion with a dictatorial tendency. Nobody will have ever thought that a day will come in the history of America that a big media behemoth like CBS 60 Minutes will be told to drop a story because Barry Weiss, that leans towards Trump, doesn't want it. This year, CBS was sold. The likes of Jimmy Kimmel was almost cancelled, if not for the people power that protested. Then the rise of ICE, then the proliferation of the No Kings protest, the resilience of the protest in America. The Epstein file. This year was the year of the Epstein file. You know, little did we know that the same Epstein file that Trump used to campaign and indict people like Bill Clinton by saying the Democrats were corrupt, he will not be able to release the Epstein file because it borders around him. And the Epstein file we'll talk about today is a triumph for independent journalists. We don't give the woman enough that first made the discovery, a journalist from the Miami Herald, that first spotted something wrong, that first spotted the fact that Epstein got a very easy deal by the then, Trump, I think representative of the Department of Justice or thereabouts. And because of that, she said something was fishy there and she discovered the treasure trove of documents and victims of the Epstein file. Let's not also forget that this was the year that Virginia Giuffre had to take her own life because of the pain the Epstein file, brought. Let's not also forget the disintegration of the right-wing movement. For the very first time, something shifted. Israel, among the popularity contest, in the popularity poll in America, it showed that more Americans were leaning towards the Palestinian than the Israelis. Big right-wing podcasters, the likes of Tucker Carlson, started to say America first shouldn't involve Israel. The likes of Nick Fuentes of this world started to speak against Israel. So when you see Turning Point USA, and let's not forget our commiserations to the family of Charlie Kirk, this year was killed. Turning Point USA, for the very first time, you have people fight among themselves in Turning Point USA. The likes of Tucker is going ahead against Ben Shapiro, and they're saying an internal civil war is happening in the right-wing movement. But let's not also forget that on the left, you have voices like Mehdi Hassan, who, by the way, lost his father this year, became very strong. And the advocacy for the Palestinian movement became very strong. And it was this year that we had some sort of peace. Some would say peace of the graveyard, where Trump brought forward an idea that, okay, let's have sort of like a coalition where you can have interested parties govern the area and all of that. But it has tilted more towards Israel because Israel has just redrawn the line and they've taken more ground on the Palestinian ground. It was this year, yes, Israel made a lot of incursions. A lot of top Palestinian chiefs were killed. The Yahya Sinwars of this world and a couple of other people were killed. So it was a big year in the terms of hegemony on the American front. On the Chinese front, yes, they showed America that your tariffs might be something you think you want to use to pull other nations down, but China has a way of doing trade. So China gained one up as regards trade against America, and that continued. And the effect of the tariff started to bite the American economy, a lot of job losses and the likes. Trump had to fire people, that were in charge of iterating the job data and the likes. It was also this year we had the disintegration of USAID. That really affected us a lot back here, although you will see from exit statements, the likes of Elon Musk too felt the pinch because his company shares went down, people protested against Tesla and the likes. What also happened is that there's been a lot of regrets, as regards that action, because it's now obvious that America does indeed need, that soft power. And the so-called cuts they made from USAID, they didn't really upend the cause of, the economy. They didn't really make any cuts with Doge, as it were. So Doge was sort of like a scam. Then on the African front, hegemony, the dictators came back. It was appalling. The likes of Biya came back after disputed elections. You can see what you talked about, what's happening in Guinea-Bissau. We can see what even happened in Côte d'Ivoire, suppressing the likes of Tijan Thiam, and then attempted coups, which must also add was because the likes of Talon became very dictatorial in power. Not that I support any coup, but we should know that there are consequences for actions, This was also the year that all of a sudden, somebody that was on the wanted list of America became the hero of America. I'm talking about Sharia. In a bid to be able to, make peace. In fact, I think the very poignant moment was the moment where one of the top American, I think it was David Petraeus, that sat down in an international security conference with Sharia and was telling him that, do you know I once had a bounty for your head, because of the atrocities you committed. So that's the way of the world. For me, in projecting the world 2026, I don't think the parameters will change. Congo will still rage on. Like they say, where logic ends, Congo begins. The fight in Congo will still rage on. The Middle East crisis, like I've always argued, is still a piece of the graveyard. Trump will still deepen. Probably, maybe he will get CNN like he's always wanted and silence more voices. And it's still going to be that international bleak order, except if something upends everything. And congratulations, Lee, we had an American Pope this time.
Yeah, talking about America, a lot has already been said. Excellent report by Adefemi, and of course, she was on the pulse of most of the events that happened around the world, and in many areas, she was even present in some of these countries when it happened. So just giving that detail. It's difficult to put into a few minutes what happened on the foreign scene this year, 2025. 2025 was a very interesting year, and so I'll build up on some of the stories that has not been touched on that also define moments internationally. First of all, protests was a trend that we saw around the world, especially youth-led protests. Youth across, remember the Nepal in September, followed very shortly by Madagascar in September, and a few other copycats. Morocco, yes, those are lower and wrong ones in Africa. Morocco, Mali, Togo happened. So Madagascar was a big one. Nepal, Madagascar in September, and the other copycat ones that happened. What was significant about these protests that triggered had, in some areas, some changes in some of the country. We saw a prime example is Nepal, is that they were, number one, youth-led. Number two, the effect of social media. A number of these protests were engineered, where some provocations came from social media, were organized via social media and by the Gen Z. In fact, they were called Gen Z protests. In Nepal, we saw the first time where they had an interim election on Discord, a social media platform. And then also TikTok played quite a huge role. So that was also, one of the defining moments on the international scene this year. Beyond that, migration played a critical role in conversations and international politics this year, such that it ensured or sort of made a pathway for the rise of the right wing, which we were talking about, Rufai. A number of countries which were left or centrist moved more to the right with more rhetoric around migration, come take our jobs. And this was started off by President Donald Trump himself. In fact, I believe that this year more than ever, in fairness to him and his campaign for making America great again, America first, truly America dominated the conversations this year. You couldn't have international stories or international news without having the United States. So he's been in power. He was inaugurated on the 20th of January 2025. But since he was inaugurated, we have had a Trump news every single day, whether it's his rhetoric on social media, his Truth Social platform, his invasion, some of his policy directions that have not been very popular, that have moved away largely from American foreign policy, with the Venezuelan oil ship and the likes. And also, when we look at countries like France, we look at countries like the United Kingdom, where we saw the rise of the Nigel Farage party, which for a very long time you wouldn't have imagined in a country like the United Kingdom. So there had been more intolerance and more countries having more stringent policies around migration, because migration did take, was center stage of a number of conversations and even upended some politics and elections in certain European countries. I say that because they had an African impact, where we talk about the acceptance or otherwise of deportees, and we know how that has also formed some of America's policy direction for some African countries. In fact, some of the removal of aid, designations, and the likes have been said to have an underlying context of a refusal of some of these countries to accept deportees from the United States of America. So migration was also a big topic that defined international realities and conversations this year. Also, we also had the two wars, the big wars still dominating this year. You cannot talk about 2025 without looking at the Russian-Ukraine war and Israel-Palestine war, Israel-Gaza war. And we say that because when President Trump was coming into power, one of the things he had campaigned on was his ability or his promise to end the war. In fact, I give him a few months and it will be done. Unfortunately, it's almost 1 year to his first 24 hours, almost first year to the end of his tenure, to the end of his first year, not his tenure, January 2026, and we're still seeing agreements being reneged on, some progress made here before the second stage of the enforcement being done with. So that's a challenge in that area. Then finally, on the African continent, one of the biggest, of course, defining moments would be the coups, especially on the West African region front. And Adefemi touched on that when she talked about Guinea-Bissau, look at Niger. Nigeria's intervention as coming in as West Africa's own superpower, how that was in many areas didn't quite work, wasn't quite successful. The rise of the Sahelian states and the AES, their consolidation and riding on even more destabilization on this region. So it was an interesting year, 2025. 2026, would the wars end? I'm talking about the Russian-Ukrainian war, the Israeli-Gaza. Would there be some sort of ceasefire or agreement to begin the end of that war? What would democracy look like on the African continent come 2026? Are the African leaders now willing to have conversations around protecting the tenets of democracy in their countries to discourage the spate of coups that have happened, in the continent as a result of a discontent by the people as to the dividends of democracy which they are not enjoying? So 2025, interesting. Let's hope that there's a bit more settlement in 2026 and that the leaders themselves take on the role of leadership, responsibly. I'll put it that way.
Okay. You may say that 2025 was the year of Donald Trump. I thought I heard you using the word multipolarity in relation to Trump. No, multipolarity became more pronounced in spite of Trump. because what Trump was doing was attacking globalism. This idea that, the international community is a global human community, and he was promoting provincialism, which is why the second coming of Donald Trump simply upended the world politically in terms of the interconnectedness of the world as we know it. The second thing is Trump using tariffs as a weapon of bargaining. And you can just look at this in terms of, one, the tariffs against Brazil, for example, against Venezuela, against China, against Canada, and other countries, and the rhetoric that went with that. Trump, just through his America First policy, turning America into almost a unipolar authority as the primary power, the superior power of the world. And then, of course, looking down on other centers of influence in the world, he says European leaders, for example, are very weak people. And this, of course, generated, this multipolarity, the attempt within the international order system to look for new centers of power, whether it is in ASEAN or it is India, going towards Russia, or China and Russia and India trying to come together, or whether, it is in other centers where, the world begins to resist this attempt to impose the supremacy of the world on everyone. And then, of course, another thing that he did, apart from tariffs, is this provincialism, his immigration policies, America First, and then demonizing other parts of the world and persons who have benefited from the idea of America as the center of the free world. Visa restrictions, expulsion of persons, third-party countries' deportation, which Nigeria mercifully said, we have enough problems here. They may take your deportees in Eswatini and in Ghana, but in Nigeria, we have enough issues. So Trump more or less dictated the pace of, international relations in the year 2025. When you say somebody is man of the year, it's not necessarily for good. So if you take Trump as the dominant figure, it will be as a person of the year who upended the world and tried to change our world unilaterally. Even the democratic institutions in the United States, were treated shabbily by Trump with his idea of republicanism and insularity and provincialism. Now, it was also the year that the United Nations turned 80. There was the 80th anniversary summit, General Assembly of the United Nations. And interestingly enough, the major issue there, the theme was better together, a prosperous future and all of that. But at the General Assembly, the key issues were about peace in the world. The United Nations was created after World War II, to promote the cause of peace, and many other subsidiary institutions were established. But is the world safer today than it was in 1944, 1945? Hence, dominating that 80th anniversary General Assembly were the issues of crisis in the world, whether it is Palestine or Iran or Israel or Ukraine and all of that, or Sudan even. And there seemed to have been a consensus that the United Nations is, failing in terms of its framework. And hence, some of the other members were asking for reform. We have been on this issue of reform since the days of Kofi Annan, because there are other power centers now. In fact, some of the members who were not at the seat, at the table, when the United Nations was formed, and are the major contributors in terms of finance. And they are saying that this structure should be democratized so that the Security Council can be expanded. And then the South can have more voice in the deliberations. And that's why you see many of the countries, asking for an expansion of the the Permanent Council of the Security Council. Now, all of these issues will continue to make sense in the year 2026, particularly now that in 2026, Antonio Guterres is going to complete his term, and there's going to be another Secretary General of the United Nations who will have to address all of these issues. Now, the next issue will be the Gen Z protests. Ayo has already spoken about that, but if we contextualize it, those Gen Z protests, either in Asia, Bangladesh, towards the end of 2024, then what became known as the Asian Spring in Nepal, in Maldives, in Bangladesh in the year 2025. And then that Asian Spring, they spilled over into other parts of the world, Morocco, Madagascar, leading to regime change, leading to the spectacle of leaders in some of those countries having to run away. Now, the issue is about authoritarianism. The issue is about poor governance. And as we have seen in most of those countries, the young people in those countries decided to speak up. And as you pointed out, what facilitated that is the social media. In Morocco, they were even using the telephone number, the dial code of the country to express their grievances. Varying levels of success in different countries, but at least we see that the young people of the world are speaking. We had Arab Spring in the past, now we have Asian Spring, and it is spreading. And this must be a message to leaders, whether in Africa or Asia or elsewhere, that look, the people are beginning to become sensitive to their rights, and they will speak up, they will speak out, they will sorosuke, as we saw in Nigeria during the NSAS protests. Now, Africa, about the coups in Africa. Again, this is about poor governance. It's about democratic retreat. Only the other day, I was quoting Ibrahim Traoré, who took power in Burkina Faso in 2022. And he said that nothing can be achieved under a democracy. And that is the kind of sentiment that you find, in many of these African countries, Madagascar, as you are seeing, Guinea-Bissau, as we saw, and then before now in Mali, in Niger, in Chad. So the message to our leaders in Africa is that for them to be able to defend democracy, there must be the good governance quotient of it, particularly now that the Alliance des États Sahel, AES, have now said they are forming their own competition against ECOWAS. They have set up their own bank. They are setting up their own army. But the dialogue about democracy will have to continue. And it's something that civil society, the civic space, needs to be expanded. And this is the thing we're saying about election problems in the Republic of Benin, in Cameroon, the one that is brewing in Uganda, and also perhaps, in some other African countries. However, good news with democracy in Africa. I think we had the first female president in Namibia. The first time Namibia will have a female president. So that is some achievement. And we hope that she will not, I hope she will not end up like Samia Suluhu of Tanzania. Yes, who turned out to be worse than the dictators of Africa in a real sense. But on the soft side, Beyonce won Grammy Award this year. The Super Falcons, they won the 10th title of Women AFCON, and I think it was also this year that Taylor Swift got engaged, which generated a lot of excitement.
Nigeria failed to qualify for the World Cup partially.
It's an ongoing conversation.
No.
Of course,
That one will be settled spiritually.
Pope Leo XIV, Pope Leo XIV, new dispensation in the Catholic Church, and Pope Francis, I think, also died this year. But on the whole, I think that there were many moments. We probably cannot cover them all on the international scene. But it was also a year that we saw a deepening of diplomacy because of the crisis in the world. Doha became almost the diplomacy capital of the world, with the world leaders going there trying to resolve a crisis. And there is the recurrent emphasis on diplomacy as a better way of ensuring peace instead of promoting conflict. Well, maybe I will stop there. Yes, although we still have plenty of time today. When are we ending this program? 3 a.m. 3 p.m.
They had the pleasure of our company till 1 p.m.
It 3 o'clock.
Anyway, let's
Food is
take a
served
short
at my house at 1 o'clock latest.